auspicious start to the Vancouver Food Summit. I've enjoyed immensely the sessions I've been in. We have a set of panelists here for a session that worries about food banks. What do we do about food banks? There are three panelists here today. I'll take them in order from my far left. Art Sherman-Hess is the CEO of the Greater Vancouver Food Banks. Next to him is Peggy Wilmot, and Peggy runs a food bank in Victoria. And here, immediately beside me, is Jerry Casson, and he is a public health nutritionist. All of them, in various ways, from different perspectives, as you can tell, have been working with food banks. So the good folks at Gordon Neighborhood House have handed us three questions. First, this overarching, hand-wringing kind of question, I like to think of it. What do we do about food banks? The second one, which we'll get to, is do we still need food banks? And the last, what has to change? So those are the questions that will structure most of what we at least begin to say at the front of the room. And I thought I would start by asking each of the panelists to tell us a bit about themselves in relation to food banks. How have they come to know food banks in their respective jobs? And how, during the time they've been affiliated with food banks in one way or another, have they seen them evolve? So this is a question, as I see it, about this model, the food bank in the food landscape, if you will. And so we're here to worry about it and maybe champion it. Who knows? But that's what's coming down the line. So, Art, I am going to start with you. In maybe 5 or 6 minutes, can you tell us, please, about food banks from your perspective and how you've seen them evolve, if you have?
Yeah, I will. Thank you so much for that. I hope you can all hear me, this thing. Let me get it right. So my background, maybe that's a good starting point. I've worked globally as an executive in the airline food industry and retail food industry and in private equity. And in 2007, my family and I immigrated to Canada. And the very first year that we landed in Canada, I can tell you that we felt like the doctor in the taxi. There was absolutely no work for a guy who had worked globally, but had no Canadian experience. I ended up in a large not-for-profit in Calgary, where after 3 months I became the interim CEO. And there was an organization that is comparable to UGM here in town. Double the size though. And focused on homelessness, typical soup kitchen model and shelter operation. And when I left in 2012, that was an organization focused on housing and employment, because I think that's a better strategy than feeding people every day and asking them to come back the next day to do it all over again. In 2012, I had the opportunity, and you know, when you live globally in warm climates, and we came from Spain, my kids were complaining a little bit about the temperature in Calgary during the winter. You can understand significant difference there. So we had the opportunity to come to the West Coast, something that is a little bit closer to the climate that I am used to as a Dutch guy. So I felt very much at home. And I had the opportunity to be interviewed for the position of CEO of the Greater Vancouver Food Bank. That was actually the first time that I stepped into a food bank. And from the beginning in my discussion with the board, I said, if you want to keep the food bank as is, then don't hire me, because I don't believe in just handing out food and do it all over again for the rest of my life. Anyhow, they hired me. So we started on a journey. And I must admit, when I learned about the food bank and what I found in the food bank, and if you come from an airline industry where in the 1990s, in the beginning of that, in the 80s and the 90s, where you're serving caviar and and goose liver and all those type of beautiful products, and you walk into the food bank, it's kind of a shock, I can tell you that. So I learned a lot about the quality of the food and about the organization. And the way I found the organization in 2012 was like, and Diane Collis always says, you know, it was a dinosaur, absolutely. It was stuck in its thinking for 32 years. And there was a lot of work to be done before we were even you know, heading into a direction where I feel that the food bank should be heading to. So quality of food is a serious issue. The way people were accessing that food, I think, was something that had to be addressed. I was shocked by the amount of lineups that I found. And you know, if you think about dignity, now there you have one. And about food literacy and you know, the knowledge about food and how people are connected to food nowadays. A little bit of a background. I come from a family where, you know, even if it's 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, we have a meal together as a family. The telephones are gone, and we share a story, and we cook from scratch every single day. So a little bit the background of a guy who walked into an organization that didn't progress, you know, over the last 30 years. Accepted every food item that it could to distribute it to people, and it was a model, you know, stuck in a transactional relationship with its members or recipients, whatever you would like to call. And so there's a lot of work that we have to do, but you know, I can speak for a much longer time than 6 minutes.
It's very interesting. I come from a completely different background to my food bank experience. I'm actually I was an educator. I was a school principal for many years, and when I retired, I was looking for something that was worthwhile, as worthwhile, or maybe more. And I go to a big downtown church in Victoria called St. John the Divine, and we've had a food bank in our basement for about as long, 30 years or so. So just 2 years ago was when I took over as a volunteer, and I'm the coordinator of all the volunteers. So it's been an interesting journey. I do believe I've changed some things in the last couple of years, but it's not, I think churches are not quick to change. I think 75-year-old volunteers are sometimes quick to change, but not often. But we've always had a very fine tradition that it would be a ditch to die in, and that is that we let our clients choose the food that they want. We have a standard list of food that we buy, and it's good quality. It's been, my list of selections has been vetted by a nutritionist who says, well, more fresh food would be good, but you know, you're getting the best bang for your buck with the things that you actually are offering people. So what happens is that they come in and sit down with a volunteer, and they get to choose from what's on the list. Now, it's not great, it's not an experience I would recommend, but if you have to go to a food bank, it's, I think, the way you can treat people with the greatest amount of respect. I don't go to my local grocery store and get handed a bag and be told this is your food for the week, and I don't think our clients should have that happen either. However, I would really love to close my food bank down, but that's another whole story. Maybe we'll get into it later on.
So I'm not entirely sure why I was invited. Peggy, in case you didn't hear it, Peggy said, because you're so good looking.
I'm going to leave here.
I'm a long-service public health dietitian. I have worked in a variety of centers all across British Columbia, Kamloops, the Northwest, including Haida Gwaii, Terrace. In 1994, I moved to Greater Vancouver and began working with Fraser Health. I worked in the Tri-Cities and New Westminster. In 2010, I moved to Vancouver Coastal. I now work in the Sea to Sky Corridor, Squamish, Whistler, Pemberton, Squamish Nation, the Southern Statlium Health Society, and with the Lilwat Nation. And I also work 2 days a week with the First Nations Health Authority, supporting pregnancy outreach staff in the 203 communities in British Columbia. So maybe that's why I got invited. It's just like, if you stay around long enough, you get invited to things. I'm not sure.
The three of them together offer a really interesting set of perspectives, complementary ones. We've got from Jerry, I think, a regional perspective that extends up the coast and inland. He was with Fraser Health Authority as a public health nutritionist. That's the biggest health authority in the province, if I'm not mistaken. Vancouver Coastal Health, another huge one, population-wise, and way up the coast. So, and now, most recently with the new Aboriginal Health Authority. There's potential here. I trust. I trust you, Jerry. And then a food bank in Victoria, central Victoria, and we know that as the site of the big homeless tent city. And really interesting, complex stories coming out of a food bank there, I'm sure. And then in art, again, a regional perspective, but on the system of food banks. So I'm trying to shore these people up in terms of, but I'm wondering if we could make another round, and to the extent that you're able and comfortable, I know you haven't prepared for this, perhaps if you can give us a few numbers. Art, for example, how many food banks are in the Greater Vancouver Food Bank system, and how many people come to them, and how has that grown? I think growth is what we've seen. Over the last 4 years you've been there.
Luckily not growth, so that's the good thing. The Greater Vancouver Food Bank serves the municipalities of Vancouver, Burnaby, New Westminster and the North Shore. A total of 26,500 individuals every week, which is a shocking number if you think about it. In 2012 that number was 28,500 people, so you know it's great that there is less access to the Greater Vancouver Food Bank. And I always say, I would be happy if we're the smallest food bank in the province and the most efficient. It is a large number, and we need to find ways to bring that number down to 0. Period.
Thanks, Art.
So ours is very different. We are in the basement of a church, which is in, as you heard, downtown Victoria, where we have lots and lots of challenges. We've always had them, now it's just more public. Anyway, we keep statistics. It's usually about 5,000 client visits per year. So Art's talking about per week, I'm talking about per year. I have a little troop of volunteers, which is actually quite amazing. I have about 80 people who volunteer. And one of the things I'm proudest of is that they're not all from the church, but they're from the broader community. And that, to me, is very important. We also have clients who volunteer to help, and that's a huge, huge breakthrough for some of my older volunteers. They can't quite believe it, that we would let clients volunteer. But I'm just delighted whenever I see that happen.
When I'm speaking about food bank usage numbers, I always like to remind people that these numbers are not reflective, excuse me, these numbers are not reflective of food insecurity as a whole, that many, many people do not access food banks and yet are still living in food insecure households. So as appalling as these numbers are, they are just a small percentage of the overall food insecurity that occurs in Canada.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay, I'm going to go around again, starting with Art, and ask this question, do we still need food banks?
It would be great if we wouldn't. But the reality is that there are indeed many people that are food insecure, and on the short term, I think there needs to be something that provides individuals with food that they need. I think as a society we need to work towards finding ways that people do not have to access food banks. That would give me more free time, that's for sure. And I think that is, as a society, what we should aim for. But that's not only the people that are in this room who all believe that food banks should not be there. That's an entire society that understands that social service will cost some money, and that we have to invest in it.
Peggy, your thoughts?
Unfortunately, we do still need food banks. I would give anything to be able to close the doors, but there would be a lot of very disappointed people. I think we need to, I'm not going to be saying anything you don't know, the whole sort of charity justice continuum, if you like, or opposite sides of a coin. We need to look at that really seriously and not ever fool ourselves that by giving money to a food bank we're solving anything. However, we have to keep working on the one hand for justice, but keep looking after people who need the food on the other hand until we have achieved that goal of not needing to have a food bank anymore.
So I agree and have nothing to add.
All right, okay. We're going quickly through our questions. Thanks. This will leave lots of time for questions from the audience, and that's just fine. So I think in the write-up you will have read about Art's work. He is described as having changed the food banks in the Greater Vancouver food system from reacting to emergency food needs to more of a focus on empowering people to nourish themselves. Art, do you want to say a bit more about how you're doing that?
Yeah, I think we started in our organization with putting a plan together, the first strategic plan in 32 years of the Greater Vancouver Food Bank. And we've grown our team significantly focused on the long-term solutions. And I think that is an incredible commitment of quite a few people in this room to join me in the journey to change the way food banks operate. And we're starting here, but there's a lot of organizations across the nation that are looking at the Greater Vancouver Food Bank and say, hey, what are these guys doing? And maybe we can have an influence nationwide. That's what my hope is eventually. Handing out food every week and asking people to come down, and take one full day out of their lives, if you think about it and you step away from that whole concept, is not the right way to do it. At the moment, people, the way food banks operated, let me first go to the food. Accepting everything. It was a volume-focused organization, and I think many food banks are. The more food we can get, edible food was the description, I think, the better it is because we can distribute more. And it never looked at nutritional values of food or the quality of food. So I think if you just think about the work that we are doing and still have to do in changing the quality of food is massive, because we get food from various streams. We have industry donations, we have food drives, we pick up at supermarkets, etc. And anytime you do a food drive, you get donated products that people eat themselves or they find in their cupboards because they've been there for quite a while. And a great example is in December of 2015, we received pasta that we figured out was at least 60 years old. I'm not joking. Catelli, even though, didn't know that a product from that age was still around. So what did we do to get control or to at least have an understanding of the food that we get into the food bank? So we now have a department called Food and Education. And it used to be that the warehouse would more or less dictate what people would eat. I don't think, I love warehouse guys, but from a nutritional value, there's not a lot of knowledge in that specific department. So we move that responsibility to our food and education department. And they are there now to get an understanding of the baseline of quality, that's A, and B, to set the menu framework. So what is it that people need, and how are we going to create a menu on a weekly basis that is, from a quality perspective, a nutritional perspective, much better than we have distributed for a long time. If you then think about the variety of products that we get into that system through all kind of channels, the diversity is probably bigger than the largest superstore in town. So just to do a baseline study takes an incredible amount of effort. We are in the process. We have great support now from UBC as well, from a database perspective. And we start to get an understanding of what we actually have in the warehouse. And if you know what your baseline is, you can start educating your donor base as well, because that's where that food is coming from. And if you have no understanding of nutritional values, and we didn't 4 years ago, then it's very difficult to start educating your donors. And I think that's the next big step that we're going to do. Just to give you an example, food drives. If you think about schools, and you think about the nutritional guidelines that we're building at the same time, and they are based on the BC school system guidelines and also the vending machine guidelines. And we're going a little bit more strict than that. And you look at food that's being donated, 80%, there's a large portion of food items is soup. You would think, oh, it's nice, warm and welcoming, and it's a great product. But if you then compare those soups against your nutritional guidelines, 80% of that soup shouldn't even be distributed because the sodium levels are so high. From a health perspective, we should not distribute that product. So that's what we're doing at the moment, understanding what we have in the warehouse. Then you think about the model, the way people have accessed that food. They're standing in line. It used to be if you're the first one in line, you probably had the better food. So that's a good reason to stand in line hours, because if I was the first one, at least I get better food than the one who is last, who get the crumbs. So changing that model of how that food is being distributed. And here in Gordon Neighborhood House and on the North Shore, we've introduced the Community Food Hub, that in my opinion is a food and wellness marketplace where we no longer hand out food. We allow people to make their own choice. They get a shopping basket. In those spaces, we, through partners, sell food at very, very low and affordable price levels, which is all fresh produce. And we have increased our distribution of fresh produce significantly. This weekend I was in the Okanagan to speak to our farmers. And it's great when you really move away from food raising to fundraising and being allowed and able to buy more and more local and fresh produce. So a different way of allowing people to access that food, create a more welcoming and warm and dignified space where people now get a time slot. So the lineups are hopefully nearly gone, and we're striving to eliminate all the lineups of every 14 locations that we serve by 2018, because I think that's really crucial. And also create a space where indeed people can make their own choice, and where we also listen to them, for what kind of foods they want, etc. So it's really focused on providing more dignity. Anyhow, I can fill the hour if I need to, but I think it's time to hand it over. But yes, there's a lot of things happening in our organization, and it's only possible because I know Paul has an incredible team. I have an amazing team.
Thanks, Art. Would it be fair to say then that part of the food bank is morphing into the community food hub?
I hope so. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. We need to move away from that old model where it's so transactional that you don't even engage in a conversation with those who are standing in line. To me, that's shocking, because we can learn a lot from our members. Yeah.
Thanks. And Peggy, it sounds like the way that you have the volunteers at your church interacting with the folks who are coming in for food means that that you're working at reducing the social stigma. Would you say that's the case? And can you say, this is your question, so I know it's on your mind. Can you tell us a bit about how you work on that?
Well, we try very hard, indeed. We try to make it a welcoming space, even though it's down in the basement. We put out card tables, and we put out magazines, and we try to bake muffins if we can. We serve juice instead of coffee, because people can get coffee anywhere, and juice is marginally more nutritious. And then everybody gets as long as they need with one of the volunteers to talk about what they're going to choose for that week. We have this sort of standard list of about 25 different items that are the nutritional basics, like oatmeal and peanut butter and staples and things. But we also get donations, which can range from artichoke hearts to chipotle, this and that. And so we have a special table that we put all those out on, because sometimes there's really good stuff like salmon, tinned of course, but still. And so people can come and they have their nice moment with the volunteers, who are all very dear and really kind, and choose what they want. And then they can go to the table and choose one of the items, or two, depending on what their bounty is like that week, that day. So one person's artichoke hearts might be someone else's grass jelly, right?
Right.
The people give you sometimes things that are really dear to them, so they might give a jar of antipasto. Well, that's lovely. So anyway, that part works well. And we try hard to reduce the stigma, but we can't remove it completely.
If you were to think about the evolution of the food bank at your church,
Yes.
what would you point out to us?
Over the last couple of years, especially, I would say letting the clients be part of it to whatever extent we're comfortable doing, or they're comfortable doing. Just trying to be more welcoming and less authoritarian, I think is the words that I could use. We are also part of something that I'm quite excited about. Maybe this is as good a moment as any to talk about it. In Victoria, we used to have a very, very competitive climate, where all the different food banks, there were about 4 of them, and they were all competing. There was the Food Banks Canada Food Bank that got all the good stuff as far as the rest of us were concerned. They were meant to share with the rest of us, and we never saw a thing. Well, maybe they had more clients, I don't know. But it was a horrible, horrible environment. So good old Victoria Foundation put us all together in a room, and once the blows were averted, we started to know each other, and we finally, this is about 3 years later, we have something called the Food Share Network, and we're establishing ways of kind of evening out the gluts and the scarcities that inevitably happen across the city, where somebody's got better connections than somebody else. We've also got a pilot project called the Food Rescue Project with 2 of the 12 Thrifty stores that we have in Victoria. And I don't like to be cynical, the fact that there's now quite hefty dumping fees for putting food waste into the landfill has inspired them to try to find somewhere else to put their almost compostable food, but not quite, and still okay if you can get it to people right away. So we're trying to figure out how to get that handed out in a timely fashion. So we're managing quite well, but there's only 2 Thrifty stores who are part of this pilot. When there are 12 of them, it's going to be a tsunami. But we are aware that, as I think you already said, Art, there's several other groups of people who are food insecure but who don't come to food banks. And so trying to think of creative and respectful ways of getting this, yogurt that's 5 days from expiring, I'd eat it. Would you eat it? Of course. So it's not really offensive. There's some things I get that I wouldn't put out for the clients because I think it's insulting, because it's really not nice. But a cauliflower with a little brown spot on it, gee, I got one of those in my own fridge, so I don't think that's bad. Anyway, so we're working on creative ways of getting what we hope is going to be a much larger amount of fresh produce and dairy out to people.
Thanks.
That's a good thing.
Thanks, Peggy. Jerry, there's all this expertise here sitting in your brain as it relates to food nutrition. Art has talked about food and education, building that up in his Greater Vancouver Food Bank. And we just heard about food that is was formerly destined to the dump, being rerouted. So it makes me think of the changes that you've seen. Perhaps your comments, please, on the overall quality of the food that turns up in food banks, how that's changing, maybe different parts of the system, and different things you can say about food quality or nutritional value in food banks.
So there's a variety of changes. Some years ago, I think in the mid-90s, the Surrey Food Bank commissioned a study to ask people what would be better ways to get. And what came out of it is pretty much what Art's described. And so it's really rewarding to see that that has now come to fruition. Another thing that I see in the spectrum is that stores now offer, some stores anyways, now offer like food bank packages that, you know, this is our $10 package, this is our $25 package, that are great choice foods for food banks to receive. And so instead of sort of like a jar of peanut butter, which is, you know, a delicious and nutritious choice, but instead of somebody sort of putting a jar of peanut butter into the bin as they walk by, that stores have these really organized responses that are presenting really higher quality foods to the food banks. And then last but not least, that Art touched on it, but the many programs that the Greater Vancouver Food Bank coordinates. They, for many years, coordinated the Fresh Choice Kitchens, and they have food preservation training that they coordinate in a train the trainers model. So they bring people in and they train them how to can both hot water bathing and pressure canning. And so those kinds of programs really extend the reach into sort of skill building and skills based. And I'm not convinced that people, like, those are icing on the cake skills. I feel, you know, often there's I have a great fondness for an article that was written, I think in 1991 by then Kim Travers. It's called, "Do You Teach Them How to Budget?" And it's an article about her meeting with provincial minister of health about food bank systems and food insecurity, and the whole article talks about the discourse of food. And it's a fantastic article. I can't recommend it highly enough. If you touch base with me, I can provide a copy or refer you to the reference. But it's really well worth reading because it talks about the way we talk about food.
Great. Great. Thanks, Jerry. We're going to do one more round. I have one more question for the panelists, and then perhaps we can open it up to questions from you folks. The last question, starting with you, Art, if you don't mind. What, in your opinion, still has to change when it comes to food banks? What are priority areas of change for you in your work? And maybe, if you want, what is the most resistant piece, most difficult to change?
There's a lot of things, of course, that still have to change. One of the things that really surprised me when I got to the Greater Vancouver Food Bank was the lack of information or data that we had. All we would know about those who would come to us was their name, their address, their date of birth, if they were married, and if there were children, and then we would maybe ask if there was a source of, or what the source of income was. So getting a better understanding, and I think which is really critical in moving forward, is the why question. We've never asked, why are you coming? And if you know the why, then of course you can be much more efficient, A, in the services that you provide, much more targeted, but B, you can also speak more educated to not only a crowd like this, but also to many of our elected officials, for example, or the broader community. And to get that question answered, we reached out to both UBC and SFU, and we have a few of those wonderful researchers now here in the room who are helping us to get a better understanding of who is coming and why are we accessing food banks. And with that information, of course, we can do so much more in our advocacy towards the outside world. I think that is one of the main things that we need to resolve, and to have I have a board meeting in an hour from now, being able to present the first dashboard of our hub space and our depots to show, to get a better understanding of our members is an incredible step forward for an organization that has never done these things. So that's one thing. Education is a very critical component moving forward, not only with adults, but also with youth and children. And so we will definitely focus on these components. But also, as an organization, we need to be more active in discussions. And a good example is a proposal that was introduced by the National Zero Waste Council in the fall of last year, that ended into this year, and it's still an ongoing discussion, where they were proposing to divert all edible foods from the landfill to charity. And when you read something like that, your hairs go up, and luckily I went to the barber this week, but they still go up, because if you think about just that statement, right, it means that there is so much work to be done, even among our for example, elected officials or the organizations that are involved in policy work. Edible foods includes Halloween candy, many chocolates, and a lot of garbage that shouldn't even get to the door of the food bank. You think about that. So I think we were the only food bank in Canada that spoke out against, a proposal like that. So as food banks, we need to do a lot more. If you think about the reason that we exist, income is, of course, a big issue. So we need to speak about these issues more openly and broadly, so that we can start to see change, right? And collectively, and that's why I got involved also in Food Secure Canada, where we need to bring the food bank world and Food Secure Canada worlds together, and have a bigger voice, plus the academic world, and then I think we can maybe start to see some movement. And anyhow, I can answer many more.
But you have a board meeting in an hour.
There you go. Well, lucky me, yeah.
Well, it's occurred to me a couple of times in what the panelists have said here that traffic congestion in our cities is a force for diverting food waste to places like food banks, or could be. Anyway, Peggy, your thoughts, please. What in your world is really resistant to change? What are priorities for change if you only could?
A number of years ago, Faith in Action, which is an advocacy group, multi-faith advocacy group that I'm involved with, put on a series of presentations, and Graham Riches came and helped us a lot, where we talked about the right to food. And we titled it, "Imagine a community where food banks were no longer necessary." It was a very good exercise for people. But it really just comes down to the fact that some people do not have enough money to buy food. And the people that we particularly are concerned about are the people who are on income assistance and on disability assistance. And interestingly enough, and I'm happy to say that yesterday I was part of a delegation of service providers from downtown Victoria who were finally granted an audience with the Minister of Income, what do they call it? Social Development and Social Innovation, yes. Anyway, we were lucky enough to meet with her, and we were just straight up asking for raise the rates. It just doesn't seem right. And her response, I'm sorry to tell you, was not, universally, oh yeah, what a good idea, why didn't I think of that? She basically said, well, I really have to fight hard for money around the cabinet table, and did you know that 50% of the budget goes to health care? And I think I'm proud to tell you that I spoke up and I said, well, maybe you could strike a deal with the Minister of Health, because if you gave more money to the people who are getting income assistance, his health budget would go way down. I don't know whether she'd ever thought of that or not, but anyway, I think that's the thing that's most resistant. It's the idea of giving people enough money that they can have the dignity to buy their own food. And yes, you can teach them budgeting, yes, you can teach people all those things about food waste, obviously all have to be part of the package. It wouldn't take a whole lot more. Yeah, it wouldn't take a whole lot more to get people to the point where they could at least buy a little bit of food. Deborah's sitting here reminding me to mention that in Victoria we are also in very good shape in getting up the equivalent to Metro Vancouver Alliance that's going to be called Greater Victoria Acting Together for the Common Good. So that may help. Maybe we'll be able to make another presentation to some level of elected officials and work on this all together.
Great. Thanks, Peggy. Jerry, in your world.
Yeah, so everything Peggy just said, ditto. For me, it keeps coming back to that discourse. If I run a food list, I run a listserv for dietitians, and I send out all kinds of informational tidbits to them. And in my footer, I comment that, if you're a for-profit society, well, maybe you should consider spending the amount that you would have spent on human resource on, contributing to a food-related charity. And over the years, this has generated, a fair sum. But it's always to food banks. And I think that's where we need to look at changing the discourse. When people say, what action shall I take? When I'm a teacher and I want my class to do something to resolve hunger, and when I'm a church that wants to do something to affect hunger. Let's talk about advocacy. And, excuse me, it's so dry in here. Let's give people tools so that they can contact their elected officials and tell them that they need to increase minimum wage and need to increase social assistance. And it's not just those evil liberals. I am old enough to have lived through NDP governments, and nothing changed then either. So we need to build that volume of voices that cannot be ignored.
I agree. Thanks, Jerry. And in fact, some of you may have been in the session first off this morning with Trish Garner, making the point really effectively, I thought, that we as a society are educating our young kids to be donors to food banks, to be charitable in our thinking rather than to be social change makers. Right. Okay, this is our chance now to hear from you. Questions? We have 15 minutes. And you have an interesting group of people at the front. Ian.
So in terms of advocacy then, what do you think would be a key message that we need to be addressing, particularly around the food banks?
For me, it's really, and I think for Peggy, raise the rates. Right, we need increased minimum wage, we need increased social assistance rates. Maybe it's not just that, right? Maybe it's things like, I don't know, child care subsidies. Maybe it's stuff like, there are lots of things governments can do to increase the amount of money that people have to spend on a variety of things, including food. So the simplest answer for me is raise the rates. But there's a whole bunch of other things that can come along with that, because there's always this reluctance, opinions expressed are solely my own. But there's always this idea that those people are getting something that I'm not getting. And if they just pulled up their bootstraps like I did, then there wouldn't be a problem. And that's a very privileged viewpoint. And so let's break down that viewpoint and say that there's room for everybody at the table and the food is delicious.
It also seems like food security is not linked to these other social policy issues as well as it could be. We're not hearing enough about the levels of food insecurity.
Yeah,
We're hearing a lot about affordable housing, the need for childcare, and so on.
And Peggy's point is excellent. If you spent more money on social programs, the health budget would go down. Like we have studies to show.
Well, affordable housing is another one I think we throw in there, because so many of the people I see are spending all their money on rent, because that really is the first thing you have to spend your money on, and then you run out, so you can't buy food, so you have to go to the food bank. So affordable housing is in that mix too.
I think what you hear is that it cannot be done, if you think about the basic income discussion, which is a very important one, but it cannot be done in isolation of other policies. In Alberta, the Alberta government in 2011 increased their age distribution, and it went up from about $1,156 to over $1,500. The same day, the rents increased with 30% because there was nothing that would limit, right, the rent increases. And that's what I mean. It's good to speak about basic income, but we also need to speak about other policies that are combined to these steps, because otherwise we are not gaining a single step.
Next, please, your name and organization. And we have a third question at the front here. Carol, comment.
Okay, my name's Graham Riches. I think I no longer have an organization because I'm retired, but I think the point that I want to key in is the last point that was made about advocacy. And I suppose my question to the food bank groups are, where's your voice? Where's your voice in the political debate and the political discussion about what needs to be done? Because as I said in the other session, that we've had a love affair with charity and food charity for 35, 40 years. It's a love affair actually that we've imported from the United States. If you actually look at the United States and how the United States actually addresses food insecurity and addresses poverty, it's largely through food-based programs, not just food banks, but public food assistance programs. This is a problem because then if you look at the metrics in Canada and the United States about food insecurity, the levels in the United States are twice that in our country. If you go back to the first presentation this afternoon, from the presenter from Oregon, she had on the first disc 1.1 million Canadians. That is actually incorrect. It's 4 million Canadians who are actually food insecure, 60% of whom are working. They're not actually on welfare. They're not, so we've got to get our heads around this issue. If you start having living wages and you start increasing minimum wages, then I think you'll see a rise in welfare rates. And just one final point, Michelle Stilwell is actually my MLA on Vancouver Island. We actually had a discussion with her from Kairos. Very interesting, the same kind of response, what can I do kind of thing. We also have a new NP, Gord Johns, who's now in Parliament, thank heavens. And we actually had a discussion with him about this whole food waste incentivized program, which actually is a private member's bill from the NDP, which is really, really problematic. Tommy Douglas would be turning over in his grave in terms of what actually is going on. So my sense, my sort of invitation is to the food banks, who I know are actually corporately controlled at the senior sort of level, by the corporate food sector nationally. Where is that voice? Because it's a very sort of problematic discussion. And we need food policy, but we need joined up food policy. Joined up, I think you've all reflected it in different ways. Social policy, environmental policy, public health, these are key voices. They've got to come together. I think, Diana, Food Secure Canada, is well aware of this and very knowledgeable. That's actually the strategy that has to happen. I'm sorry if I've gone on too long.
No, thank you.
just as a counterpoint, last year I was listening to the CBC Food Bank Day and was very pleased to hear Art saying everything we've just set up here today. So the message is coming from the food banks as well. It just, again, needs that volume of people, volume of the electorate to echo that message over and over and over to all parties, in my view.
Let me,
Graham about CBC Food Bank days.
anyhow, let me speak to that, Graham. I fully agree that as food banks, we need to speak much louder than we've ever done. I've joined an organization called Food Secure Canada. That's one thing. But we also, this weekend, for example, I met with the CEO, the interim CEO of Food Banks Canada, and its policymaker. And I said, you know what? This small organization was much more front and center during the election than Food Banks Canada was in the last 4 years that I've worked there. So I challenged them on these things. Food Banks BC had its conference this weekend, and we had a room full with MLAs. And there wasn't a single pitch to those individuals. So there's a lot of work to be done in that food banks world to get people along in our journey. And I know there's a lot of work to be done to get a better voice. But we need to understand that even in the Greater Vancouver Food Bank, we had no data about our members that we could share with the general public. And for me to speak in general terms is not as comfortable when I have data backing me up in the work that we do. Now we start to get that data. Jennifer Black is here from UBC, who has now done the first pilot study in the field. And she gives me more information so that we can speak more educated to a crowd like this, but also to the general public. The Greater Vancouver Food Bank has just completed an environmental scan among 20, I would say, progressive food banks. And it's our aim to bring at least 15 of those into the Food Secure Canada Assembly space in October. Why? Because we need a dialogue. We need a dialogue to see the food bank world move into the world of the food security world. And then we can start to get, I think, leadership. It all comes down to leadership, also at Food Banks Canada level. Do we have an influence? I think there's a significant voice at that table from our end to start influencing the behavior, I think, of an organization like that. The board of Food Banks Canada, indeed, there are larger corporations on that board. So the optics are not right. And they're still thinking we need to meet a certain volume target. Now we start to get understanding of the quality of food. We can share that. We gave that to the policy director of Food Banks Canada yesterday, and he's taking it home. So that's the way that we engage in that world to make sure that they are getting more educated, and there's more pressure from larger food banks to get Food Banks Canada in that journey.
Thanks, Art. We have a question from the second, no, it's a comment. Carol White.
So I'll just, I think I can speak.
It's right here.
Can't speak loudly enough. I really wanted to extend an invitation because of the comments that you had made to join the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition, because the information that you're talking about, the cost of poverty, is on that website, and there's been a tremendous amount of research, and I know that there are other people that are in the room, and I am on the governance team, but I cannot think of a stat to save my life right now. But all those conversations, all those interactions that happen at all those different levels, I really want to applaud what you're doing and to join this voice, because we have a window. We have to bring food justice, poverty to the next provincial election. This is a group that's going to do it, everyone that's here. That conversation has to happen with everyone, NDP, Greens, with the Liberals. And that's an opportunity for the people here to join in this conversation on a broader level.
Thanks, everyone. Art, Peggy, Jerry, you were excellent panelists, and I want to thank you very much.